Back in November 2025, George R.R. Martin did an interview with The Hollywood Reporter that just got released today. The author is James Hibberd, who you've probably heard that name before. He's basically the premier source for all George R.R. Martin news in the Hollywood trades. Whenever there's news breaking about Game of Thrones, House of the Dragon, any proposed prequel series, it's almost always James Hibberd breaking the news. He even has this book called Fire Cannot Kill a Dragon. I have a copy of it around here somewhere, which is basically a behind-the-scenes book about the making of Game of Thrones. It's pretty interesting stuff. So this information is from November, but we are reading it in January, and I'd say there's a few main points that I want to talk about. It's a really revealing article, the most information we've gotten about Martin and his progress on Winds in quite some time. Not that it's necessarily good news, mind you, but let's get into it. I'm going to jump around a little bit here, but just as a little preview, Martin gave us some spicy drama tidbits with his beef with Ryan Condal. We all know about his infamous Beware the Butterflies post from a couple years ago. And then George seemingly outright confirmed that Jon Snow will have chapters in the Winds of Winter. George talked about actually writing Dunk and Egg stories in the past year. And then he gave us some info on Tyrion and Sansa, and that he was planning originally to kill Sansa, but maybe has shifted off of that course. So here's what George said about Dunk and Egg. Quote, "The big issue is that I have only written 3 novellas, and I have a lot more stories about Dunk and Egg in my fucking head. I've got to get them down on paper. I began writing 2 at various points in the past year. One is set in Winterfell, and one set in the Riverlands." End quote. So this is pretty awesome, just to hear that George has been actually writing in the past year. I mean, we always know he's tinkering with the Winds of Winter, but actually making progress and writing Dunk and Egg or Fire and Blood 2 makes me think that something Westeros related could be on the publishing horizon, I guess. The Dunk and Egg novella set in Winterfell is supposed to be the 4th one, so it happens after the Mystery Night. And Martin has told us very little about it, but we know that Dunk will encounter the Shewolves of Winterfell, hence the title. But he's also said that's just a working title, and that the final title might be something different. He said that back in 2014, so who knows really. The plot is basically surrounding the succession crisis of Winterfell after Lord Baron Stark's death. There are 5 Lady Starks running Winterfell, and 4 of them are widows of a bunch of recently deceased Lord Starks. And then there's also the current Lady Stark, whose husband is in his 30s and is fading fast from a wound taken from fighting the Ironborn. He said that in 2006. In the Mystery Night, Dunk says, "Egg and I have a long journey before us. We're headed north to Winterfell. Lord Baron Stark is gathering swords to drive the Krakens from his shores for good." We also know from A Dance with Dragons that Baron Stark made common cause with the Lannisters of Casterly Rock in his war against Aegon Greyjoy. This is during the reign of Aerys I, when Hand of the King Bloodraven is basically ruling the realm. But then from a Victorian chapter, in Book 5 again, he mentions his ancestor Lord Dagon Greyjoy bearded the lion in his dead and tied the direwolf's tail in knots, but even Dagon could not defeat the dragons. So roughly, the story will go that the Greyjoys are having success against the Starks and Lannisters, but then Egg must call upon his family for help, and Bloodraven presumably marches north with the Targaryen army and saves the day, or maybe sends the Red Wine fleet. I don't really know how that's going to happen, but the dragons, or the Targaryens, help save Winterfell from the Greyjoy attack. Well, we know that Baron Stark dies from a wound he took fighting the Greyjoys, so that means one of the women we're focusing on is Laura Royce, his wife. Now, they had 7 children together, and some of those sons were married to other women who might be involved in this she-wolves business. We have Lyanne Glover, who was the first wife of Willem, the second son of Laura and Baron. We also have Melantha Blackwood, the second wife of Willem. Ardos the Implacable married Lysara Karstark. And then there's actual female Starks, Barenna and Alysanne. And lastly, there's Arya Flint, who married Roderick. So all of these women could be involved somehow. but it's unclear how the succession crisis actually unfolds. Maybe folks are trying to make Brandon the next Lord of Winterfell, but Leanne Glover died in childbirth having him, so maybe Melantha Blackwood doesn't want the first kid, Brandon, to succeed Donor and Willem to be the heir, but she wants her first son, Edwild, to be the heir. I don't know, it gets confusing. The novella set in the Riverlands is called The Village Hero, but George R.R. Martin has also hinted that the village hero might be before the Shewolves of Winterfell. He might be jumping around in time here. And we also know titles like the Sellsword, the Champion, the Kingsguard, the Lord Commander, basically who wants to write about Dunk's entire life, presumably all the way up until and including Summerhall. My guess would be that the village hero does take place as the fourth novella, before Shewolves, because it would make sense for Dunk and Egg to stop in the Riverlands on their way up to the north to deal with the Stark succession crisis. There's this really interesting line in a Jaime chapter from Book 5, which I imagine George wrote as some teasing or foreshadowing for the village hero. Jaime is talking to a Bracken, and Bracken mentions this village called Pennytree. That was ours once too, but it's been a royal fief for 100 years. So for 100 years, the Targaryens, or the crown I guess, has owned this village called Pennytree. And we know that Sir Arlen, Dunk's mentor, the knight who took him on as a squire way back when, the one who dies at the beginning of Dunk and Egg, Sir Arlen was of Pennytree, presumably before it was taken over by the crown. So the village hero might be about that conflict between the Blackwoods and the Brackens fighting over this village called Pennytree. Dunk gets involved because he feels some connection to it from Sir Arlen, and eventually Bloodraven has to come take it over, basically. The solution, or the compromise, is that neither the Brackens nor the Blackwoods get to claim the land. Pennytree becomes a royal fief, sort of like Summerhall. Pennytree has its name because of a huge oak tree. It's ancient and tall, with gnarled roots twisted in and out of the earth like a nest of slow brown serpents. And what's interesting is, there are hundreds of old copper pennies nailed to its huge trunk. That's how it got the name, Pennytree. Must be some sort of superstition where people put pennies up on this tree as they're passing. Since the Dunk and Egg stories are meant to be about the plight of poor people, the plight of the small folk, since Dunk is one of them, I could see maybe the residents of the village being kind of harassed by either the Brute of Bracken or the Blackwoods, some sort of conflict going on there that's harming the residents, and Dunk steps in to help them out. And then we do get some news about that scrapped Jon Snow sequel series that HBO was sort of kicking the bucket on a few years ago. Kit Harington was really involved. He had some writer friends who worked on Gunpowder, this other HBO series he did, based on one of his own royal ancestors. Both Harington and his wife, Rose Leslie, come from English royalty. Anyways, it was this dark, kind of sorrowful show about Jon Snow living alone as a broken man with PTSD up beyond the wall. He chased off Ghost for some reason and threw away Longclaw. He spends his time building cabins and burning them back down again. Basically, Kit Harington was drawing on his own personal struggles with his alcoholism and going into rehab. He calls them mental health difficulties. But HBO said the broken Jon Snow idea was too much of a bummer. And yeah, I kind of agree, because that's a premise, right? You've got a premise. Jon Snow has PTSD, no more Ghost or Longclaw. Maybe that's part of his journey, is getting Longclaw back for some purpose. There's a fight that he needs to fight, and maybe Ghost is sort of stalking him because he refuses to leave permanently, but Jon just doesn't want to see him anymore, right? That's our premise. But what's the actual story, right? What's the conflict? The wall is half demolished. The wildlings are Jon's friends now. The others are no more. His brother is king of Westeros, and his sister is queen of Winterfell. There's really nothing going wrong in Jon's life except for his mental health issues, and I don't really know how you make a series about that. What would the actual, tangible conflict be? Obviously, I would have watched it if they made it. I'll watch anything Game of Thrones related. I am a sucker. But the more interesting stuff is his relationship with Ryan Condal. He says his relationship is worse than rocky, it's abysmal, which is spicy. About Ryan Condal, Martin says, quote, "I hired Ryan. I thought Ryan and I were partners, and we were all through the first season. I would read early drafts of the scripts, I would give notes, he would change some things. It was working really well, I thought." End quote. So he says sometime in the writing process for season 2 is when Condal stopped listening to Martin. He eventually had to go through HBO and give them all his notes, and they would give Ryan Condal the notes. So then we get to Beware the Butterflies, his blog post from 2024, and we learn that an upset HBO exec had called Martin's manager, who phoned Martin's assistant, who took down the post. So one of George's minions took the post down. George didn't even delete it himself. And he says, quote, "I would have put it back up, but then I would have looked like an idiot. And 80% of it was praise, but that's not what people focused on." End quote. Obviously, George is being a little obtuse here. Nobody cares about his praise when he's talking about that he hated how much Ryan Condal misadapted his work. If you don't want House of the Dragon spoilers, by the way, don't listen to this. I'm assuming most of you guys are fans of A Song of Ice and Fire and you know the whole story. I think, if I had to guess, one of the main issues with George and Ryan Condal is that Ryan Condal is seemingly having Helena's suicide in season 3 based around nothing. That she just does it because she's kooky and she has mental health issues and she has autism, and so oops, she kills herself. She falls out of a window. But in that blog post that was taken down, George mentions that there was really no motivation for Helena's suicide. It's a very touchy subject. It has to be handled with care, and seemingly Condal did not. In the book, Helena has 3 kids, the twins, Jaehaera and Jaehaerys, and then Maelor. Maelor was present at Blood and Cheese in the book, and Helena had to do this kind of Sophie's Choice situation. Maelor was very young, but maybe old enough to be traumatized, who knows. But Helena certainly was traumatized, and it was this whole thing, obviously. Having your child murdered in front of you might do that to you. And then when Maelor dies during the rioting at Bitterbridge, and George Martin, unsurprisingly, makes some great points about his own work. So talking about cutting the Maelor stuff, since Maelor isn't going to be in the show, Martin says, quote, "I have no idea what Ryan has planned, if indeed he has planned anything. But given Maelor's absence from episode 2, the simplest way to proceed would be just to drop him entirely, lose the bit where Alicent tries to send the kids to safety, drop Rickard Thorne, or send him with Willis Fell so Jaehaera has 2 guards. From what I know, that seems to be what Ryan is doing here. It's simplest, yes, and may make sense in terms of budgets and shooting schedules. But simpler is not better. The Bitterbridge scene has tension, suspense, action, bloodshed, a bit of heroism, and a lot of tragedy. Rickard Thorne is a tertiary character at best. Most viewers, as opposed to readers, will never know he is gone, since they never knew him at all. But I rather liked giving him his brief moment of heroism, a taste of the courage and loyalty of the Kingsguard, regardless of whether they are black or green." End quote. And we do get introduced to Rickard Thorne in season 2. He's the kind of gray-bearded knight who stands outside the Great Sept of Baelor. Wait, no, not Baelor, it's just the Great Sept. And he also watches Alicent go for a swim, so it seems like they're setting him up to have this moment in the future. They're establishing Rickard Thorne so that he can die with Maelor at Bitterbridge in season 3. But apparently that's just not going to happen. Martin continues to mention that in the book, quote, "Prince Maelor's death and the grisly manner of his passing proves to be the thing that drives Queen Helena to suicide. She could barely stand to look at Maelor, knowing that she chose him to die in the Sophie's Choice scene. And now he is dead in truth, her words having come true. The grief and guilt are too much for her to bear." In Ryan's outline for season 3, Helena still kills herself for no particular reason. There is no fresh horror, no triggering event to overwhelm the fragile young queen. End quote. So this makes sense that George would have a particularly harsh reaction as Ryan Condal was working on season 3. If there is no Maelor, and add that to the weird character choices they've already made for Helena so far, how kind of emotionally detached she is from everything. She refers to her son as the boy, and she doesn't really seem all that messed up about Jaehaerys being killed in front of her. I'm really worried that they're just gonna make Helena's suicide come from her own, dream sequence. She's gonna see the future, that she has no real place in the world, and that Rhaenyra's offspring are gonna inherit the throne anyway, and It was always the story. It was the Song of Ice and Fire. I was meant to die. Some bullshit like that. Unsurprisingly, if you can't tell, I'm on George Martin's side. Ryan Condal, I think, has done a very poor job adapting everything beyond Season 1 of House of the Dragon. I've said it before, and I'll say it again right now. The first 7.5 episodes of House of the Dragon, I think, are probably the best, or maybe tied for the best, that HBO ever did of adapting George Martin's work. I love the first 7.5-ish episodes. But everything changes for the worse during that dinner scene in episode 8, where Alicent basically forgives Rhaenyra, declares for her as queen, and then 2 seconds later misinterprets Viserys' dying words, and now wants to go with Aegon as king, basically removing all the agency from both of those characters. Right? The Green Council was gonna happen with or without Alicent in the show. Aegon was always going to become king regardless of Alicent's own feelings, which is just not the case in the books. That's not the story. It just makes Alicent seem weak and wishy-washy and makes Aegon look weaker by proxy. I don't like it. And it's also just this insistence on Alicent and Rhaenyra's friendship. I liked it back in Season 1 as a way to add some depth to the characters at the younger stages of their life. Rather than having Alicent be quite a bit older than Rhaenyra, she's basically the same age in the show. Friendship turns sour, but they become friends again. That's fine. But the friendship needs to be broken off by the time Aegon becomes king. All ties need to be severed, or else the conflict just doesn't have the same tension. I'm sorry, but it's just not interesting seeing this will they won't they friendship between Rhaenyra and Alicent in the midst of an entire civil war. Right? That stuff is just not important. And it's insulting that they think that we, the audience, could believe Alicent would still want to be friends with Rhaenyra after all the turmoil and tragedy that she's been put through after the death of Jaehaerys. And vice versa, by the way. After the death of Lucerys and the stillbirth of Visenya, why would Rhaenyra even think for an instant about not fighting ruthlessly for the Iron Throne? Ryan Condal just seemingly has no desire to make his characters, especially the female characters, interesting and conniving and bloodthirsty. And that's something George Martin was really good at. You can criticize George Martin for some of his weird sexual stuff, I guess, and all the dozens and dozens of women in the books who just die in childbirth, and how, he's going for realism with that, but it's just kind of flippant the way so many women die in childbirth. But you have to hand it to him when it comes time to give women the same sort of emotional struggles and aspirations and bloodthirstiness that a lot of his male characters have. George Martin does it, and he does it brilliantly. And Game of Thrones managed it to a pretty successful degree with Cersei in Game of Thrones. I really don't know how we got from Cersei to Alicent and Rhaenyra. We've taken huge leaps backwards. So hearing that Martin's relationship with Condal is abysmal, yeah, I can see why. Ryan Condal seems to just think he's got his own story in mind for how House of the Dragon should go, and that his version is better fit for TV than Martin's. That's my speculation. And I think he's wrong. I think it's okay to make changes, obviously. You have to make changes from the source material when you're adapting it for the screen. But if you're not keeping the heart of the original story, well, you're not doing an adaptation anymore. When you're completely changing the motivations of main characters, Rhaenyra and Alicent, this isn't the story anymore. And George Martin, thankfully, even says this outright, which is just sort of therapeutic for me to hear. In that new article from today, Martin refers to a contentious Zoom call, where HBO asked him to step back from House of the Dragon altogether. This is presumably much after the Beware the Butterflies post, sometime maybe in early 2025. The purpose of the call was for Condal to present his vision for Season 3. Well, so actually this would be before 2025, because they were filming last year. So this may be before the Beware the Butterflies post. Okay. But anyways, Martin detailed his many objections and allegedly declared, quote, "This is not my story any longer," end quote. And if that quote is real, I agree. House of the Dragon is not your story any longer. It is Ryan Condal's, and we're just along for the ride. We'll see what happens. My hopes for Season 3 are not high. back in August, there was this interaction with a fan at Worldcon that went kind of viral on the internet for a few days, when some asshole fan got in line for the Q&A and basically referred to Martin letting another writer finish wins because you're not going to be around much longer. And even though everyone booed and all the authors on the panel gave Martin his support, Martin said, quote, "I really didn't need that shit. Nobody needs that shit," end of quote. And yeah, Martin's gone through a lot of shit recently. A lot of his close friends have died, and this article actually mentions it. Howard Waldrop, Gardner Dozois, Victor Milan, a lot of Martin's friends all gone one after another. And then even Robert Redford, who Martin recently worked with on Dark Winds, a TV show for AMC, I think. Robert Redford's last acting scene was this chess scene with George Martin. It was his final performance of his life, and Martin said that it was fucking weird. And yeah, that is weird. To have so many of your colleagues and close personal friends all dying over the span of a couple years, it's really not hard to fathom how Martin has had difficulty sitting down and finishing his magnum opus. He's probably been kind of depressed a lot of the time here. Martin also makes a reference to having 1,100 manuscript pages finished, but he said that number for a pretty long time. In fact, in another James Hibberd Hollywood Reporter article from 2022, so this is almost 4 years ago now, a little over 3 years actually, Martin says Winds is going to be more than 1,500 pages, and he thinks he's about 3/4 of the way done. Well, 3/4 of 1,500 is 1,125. So that means that in 2022, Martin had 1,100 to 1,200 pages of Winds done. So that's not exactly a hopeful outlook. He's at pretty much the same spot he was a few years ago. But that doesn't mean he hasn't made any changes or any progress. He's probably reworked a lot of those 1,100 pages, thrown stuff out, edited things, moved some chapters. The current 1,200 pages that he has of Winds might be a very different looking 1,200 pages from even just 4 years ago. That's just my speculation. Martin even says, quote, "I will open the last chapter I was working on and say, oh fuck, this is not very good. And I'll go in and I'll rewrite it. Or I'll decide, this Tyrion chapter is not coming along. Let me write a Jon Snow chapter. If I'm not interrupted though, what happens, at least in the past, is sooner or later I do get into it." End quote. So that quote is super interesting because he specifically mentions writing a Jon Snow chapter for The Winds of Winter. Now, did he mean to reveal this? Or was he just picking two characters out of a hat as he was talking to James Hibberd? Yeah, I'm writing a Tyrion chapter, then I'm writing a Jon chapter. Maybe those are just the first two of his own characters that came to his mind, and he just sort of flippantly said it. That is possible. James Hibberd didn't press him on this and say, "Are you confirming that Jon Snow comes back as a POV?" But I'm thinking George Martin probably just let it slip, and that Jon Snow is coming back as a POV chapter. I mean, obviously Jon Snow's probably dead right now. I mean, there's a chance he didn't actually die at the end of Book 5. George Martin likes to be kind of coy about it, and he says, "Oh, you think he's dead, do you?" But in all likelihood, Jon died at the end, but everyone knows he's going to come back to life. And because of the very popular theory, which I personally subscribe to, that before he died, his final word being ghost, that Jon kind of slipped into ghost skin and is currently a direwolf, and so when his soul is transferred back into his human body out of ghost, he won't be kind of the typical Firewhite like Beric Dondarrion or like Lady Stoneheart, that he'll more or less be himself, maybe with some attitude changes. But regardless, he'll be able to have POV chapters moving forward. And I think that's a good thing. As interesting as it would be for Jon not to have any more POV chapters in The Winds of Winter, just the challenge that would be for Martin to write, and it would be really interesting to see which other characters get taken over so that we can still see what Jon Snow is up to. Obviously we got Melisandre at the Wall, maybe Davos with Rickon comes back and looks after Jon, maybe he meets up with Sansa or Bran in Winterfell, and that's how we see what Jon's up to. But no, I think it's better for everyone to have the most popular character of the book have his own POV chapters, and I never really thought that we wouldn't get them. Jon and Dany are two halves of A Song of Ice and Fire. They are the series. This series is about Jon and Dany's union. I vehemently believe this. And so it would be kind of weird to continue having Daenerys' POV, but not Jon's. I imagine we'll get both of their POVs even when they're together in the same geographical location for the rest of the series. Then we get kind of a bleak quote here from George. He talks about meeting Frank Herbert, the author of Dune, back in 1975, and Herbert was really old at this point, it was near the end of his life, and Martin said, quote, he didn't like Dune anymore, and he didn't want to write any more Dune books, but he felt locked in by the success of Dune, so he kept writing them, end quote. So Hibbert asks if he feels similarly to how Herbert felt, and Martin basically says yes. He's not tired of Ice and Fire, he loves the world, but he does relate to how Herbert felt to some degree. Now, as a fan of A Song of Ice and Fire, who is deeply invested in getting this next book out and reading The Winds of Winter for myself, yeah, this kind of hurts to hear. That he should feel in any way similar to how Herbert was feeling locked in by the success of A Song of Ice and Fire, so having to keep writing them. I really hope that's not the case. Selfishly, I just really want to read the next book, but even just for George himself. He's already given us 5 of the best fantasy novels ever written. I hope he's doing okay mentally, I suppose. That's what my point is. And then at the end of this interview, Martin has a little quote in passing to Hibbard that maybe he thought was off the record. Probably not. I'm sure it was all above board here, but it's kind of interesting. He says, quote, I was going to kill more people, not the ones they killed in the show. They made it more of a happy ending. I don't see a happy ending for Tyrion. His whole arc has been tragic from the first. I was going to have Sansa die, but she's been so appealing in the show, maybe I'll let her live, end quote. That's pretty awesome. We don't really see George Martin talking about specifically who he wants to kill or keep alive. That's why this article is so enlightening. That's why I wanted to get on the mic today. First of all, I completely agree with him about Tyrion. I mean, he's referred to Tyrion as a villain in the past, and he is. He's a tragic villain in that he really didn't need to be one. Had he had the proper upbringing, a father who loved him, a sister who wasn't abusive towards him, if he wasn't a dwarf in a society that makes fun of dwarves, he could have been raised a very different man, more of a hero. He would probably be the heir to Casterly Rock. Although even then, he would probably be more, in that situation, more vehemently pro-Lannister, if he didn't have all this anti-Lannister baggage that he's carrying around. That Tyrion might actually be more of a villain because he'd be more of a Lannister than maybe even Jaime. That he would be even more like Cersei and Tywin had he not been born a dwarf and subject to so much abuse. That we might not like him for those reasons. That he'd be evil in that way. So really there is no winning for Tyrion here. Even though he is anti-Lannister and hates his own family, he himself is a terrible person. You know, he manipulates Aegon to try to conquer the Iron Throne when he's really not ready to do it, probably. Basically just sicking the Golden Company on the Lords of Westeros, and you know small folk are gonna die because of that. Plenty of small folk die in every war. That's just reality. So thanks Tyrion for that. And of course he rapes the Sunset Girl in that brothel. He's not super nice to Penny. He thinks very, very, very dark thoughts about Cersei, even talking about raping and murdering her. He wants to kill Jaime. He's a villain. He's dark. He's twisted. The TV show, obviously, I've been through this so much in the past. They did not want to villainize Tyrion in Game of Thrones. He was too much of a fan favorite to become dark. They just didn't want to make that commitment. And I wonder if that's similar shades of what's going on with House of the Dragon. That we need Alicent and Rhaenyra, as these two women, to be more likable. They need to be more relatable and likable and peaceful and not so ruthless. That's kind of what they did with Tyrion, whitewashing basically. And yeah, maybe some normie fans might enjoy that. Sorry for sounding so pretentious, but I think the majority of us just want a good story. And good stories have evil, ruthless, bloodthirsty characters sometimes. Even main characters, and that's okay. As long as the overall message is still one of positivity and hope, which is George Martin's whole thing. He's the very opposite of nihilistic, that in the face of all of these tragedies and horrible people, there are enough heroes, enough Briennes, enough Daenerys, that the good guys can still win in the end, that things can still turn out good. And I think that level of complexity and story writing just isn't up Ryan Condal's alley, and evidently wasn't up Benioff and Weiss's alley either. Then he says he was going to have Sansa die in the books, but because she's so appealing in the show, maybe I'll let her live. Kind of a confusing quote. He thinks the positive reaction to Sophie Turner's Sansa in Game of Thrones is going to influence his decisions with Sansa in the book? I mean, he has said that's affected some of his characters on a smaller scale. Like the way Osha and Shay were portrayed in the show, Martin says he liked them a lot better than his own writing, and that maybe shades of Natalie Tania's Osha would come into play with the future of writing about Osha in The Winds of Winter. And he's also said, back when he had positive things to say about House of the Dragon, that he liked Paddy Considine's Viserys I more than the Viserys I from Fire and Blood. Obviously there's no more writing to be done about Viserys in the books, but that's sort of similar wavelength he might be on with Sansa. I'm curious why he thinks that. I think Sansa got kind of a lot of flack from fans of the show. The way she was sort of demanding towards the end, randomly demanding that the North be a separate kingdom in the finale. I mean, your brother is literally the king. Why would you need your home country to be independent from him? It's really not gone into very much. I don't think people have a lot of positive remembrances of Sansa in Game of Thrones, opposed to like a character such as Oberyn, who died before the show got really bad. Or maybe George Martin just watched my YouTube video. Sansa Stark has died twice. Will she do it again? In that video, I'm basically talking about the character deaths of Sansa, how killing Lady killed a part of herself, and how she had to shed her Sansa Stark personality, thereby killing herself, to become Elaine Stone. But that Sansa is still alive. She's still gonna become Sansa again in The Winds of Winter or A Dream of Spring. I do believe that, because the character arc is just incomplete. It would be super unsatisfying, is my main point that I make in that video, if George Martin were to tragically kill off Sansa just for the sake of having some more tragedy, because her whole story has been tragedy. Ned dies, and Robb dies, and she's a political hostage in King's Landing, and Littlefinger takes her away after being abused by Joffrey, and she has to marry Tyrion the Dwarf, and that's embarrassing, and her whole life has just been kind of awful ever since leaving Winterfell. So why would you kill her before she's able to really accomplish anything? Before she's able to take revenge against Littlefinger, or manipulate Littlefinger for her own end, take back Winterfell, reunite with Jon or Arya? I'm a little bit surprised that George was ever planning to have Sansa die, but he was planning to. I have a feeling that maybe he was referring to his original plans, like back in the 90s. Maybe that feels just like yesterday to an old man like him, Unc. Back in the 90s, Grandpa George had this little faux outline for his editors. He really doesn't like writing outlines, he said that so many times, but I think they demanded he write one, basically just a little synopsis for how it was a trilogy at that point, how the trilogy was meant to go. I think it was Game of Thrones, Dance with Dragons, Winds of Winter. I think those are the 3 titles. And then obviously everything became expanded. But in that outline, George mentions 5 core characters who would make it to the end of the show, to the end of the series. And those characters were Jon, Bran, Arya, Daenerys, and Tyrion. Sansa was not listed. Sansa and Rickon were the only Starks not listed. Well, besides Robb, obviously. So maybe, way back when he was still planning on having this love triangle with Jon and Arya and Tyrion, maybe back then he was planning on having Sansa die somehow. But I think he's really developed her nicely with her plotline in the Vale and where that's headed with Shaedrich the Mad Mouse and the Tourney of the Winged Knights and Harry the Heir, and maybe she's still got some more political learning to do since she probably just gave away her secret identity to Miranda Royce. And George even gives a little hint that Sansa's sort of invested in what Jon Snow is up to. Says how surprised she is when she finds out that Ned Stark's bastard is the new Lord Commander of Lord Commander of the Night's Watch. You can think maybe in Sansa's head there's a little spark of hope there that, oh, Jon is in this position of power. If I can somehow find my way out of here, get Littlefinger to take me back north, maybe I can get some knights on my side. Maybe I can reveal myself to the Lord's Declarant and get the Knights of the Vale behind me. We can join up with Jon Snow and take out the Boltons and restore our family to Winterfell. That maybe Sansa wouldn't have had this thought if she still believed Jon was just a cadet in the Night's Watch, fucking around in the north. In this article, Martin also reiterates something he said several times in the past, I'm quite sure, that he's not planning on letting anybody else finish the books. He says it would feel like a total failure not to finish. He wants to finish, but if he gets struck by lightning, his work won't be finished. That's just the way that it goes. Now, I am curious about the legality of this. A couple times in this article, he mentions that Warner Brothers has the rights to Westeros. I'm assuming that just means adaptational rights. He doesn't specify that, but I don't think that Warner Brothers as a company actually owns the A Song of Ice and Fire IP. I would imagine that George still has that. And so that in George's will, obviously George doesn't have any children, and look, I'm going to get morbid here for a second. I hate speculating about this, but let's just get into it. In George's will, he can bequeath A Song of Ice and Fire to his next of kin, which would be his wife Paris, assuming that she survives him. And he can write in his will all he wants, that he doesn't want anybody else to finish the book. But I believe, and if any lawyers are listening to this, please correct me if I'm wrong, I believe the rights will revert back to the publisher after Paris' death. Unless Paris finds an heir and passes A Song of Ice and Fire IP off to somebody else, and somebody else still living has complete control over what happens to the IP, I think the rights just revert to the publisher. And I don't see any universe in which the publisher does not publish a book called The Winds of Winter at some point. Whether George Martin is still alive, or whether it's a posthumous book, basically just filled with some notes and outlines and full chapters that he's done, more of a kind of behind-the-scenes book. There's too much money on the table for Bantam and Voyager to not publish a book and get a book on the shelves of Barnes & Noble called The Winds of Winter. Probably with that fan-made black cover with the Horn of Winter on it. Because it's so recognizable at this point in the pop cultural canon. We're talking about tens, maybe hundreds of millions of dollars. I'm just kind of capitalistically cynical that book could ever not be published according to George Martin's wishes. I'm sure that, they'd get a lot of flack if, 15, 20 years from now, they decide to hire somebody to finish the book itself. That would not be cool. But I could definitely see them, and maybe George even saying that it's okay for them to do this, to publish his notes and outlines and sample chapters and basically the work he's got done for The Winds of Winter so far in a big volume called The Winds of Winter. I could absolutely see that happening. But I don't really want to talk about the future of A Song of Ice and Fire in those terms. I still firmly believe that Martin will finish it before he dies. He's not that old. He's only 77, 78, and he's in pretty good shape, pretty healthy. I hate talking about this stuff, but Martin could very feasibly live for quite a long time. Longer than it's been since Dance has been out. He's got plenty of time to finish it. Plenty of time to work on it. And even if he doesn't owe us the book. He's got to live his life. Do I want to read it? Yeah, I want to read it more than I've wanted to do pretty much anything. I want to read this book. But at the end of the day, George Martin is an artist. And artists don't owe us content. Even if we are their biggest fans and we've made him a millionaire, and it's icky to think that way, that to feel entitled to a work of art by an artist. He'll finish it when he finishes it, and if he doesn't, he doesn't. Rushing it out or hiring some other writer to do it, it wouldn't be the same. It wouldn't be George Martin's art anymore. It would just be a product. And I'm not naive. I know that all art, or almost all art, is a product. All my favorite music, no matter the artistic merits I believe that it has, whether it's the great poetry of Big Thief or Bon Iver, they're making money from it, they're making millions of dollars, it's commercial products. All my favorite movies, the Safdie brothers, the Celine Sciamma, the Green Knight, all my favorite movies, they're products. They're meant to earn money in the box office and in physical sales and digital streaming rights, right? These are products. These are commercial products meant to generate revenue. Same thing with books. I understand that, but to me it just wouldn't be the same work of art if somebody else finishes the work. And I just don't want that. Either Martin finishes it, or nobody finishes it. That's really the only way I'll be happy. I don't want anywhere in between. That would be a half measure, some uncanny valley version of A Song of Ice and Fire, if, the Expanse writers or James S.A. Corey end up finishing it. I don't want that. Obviously, that's just my take on it, though. Feel free to leave your comments down below. I'm always interested in hearing what you guys think. And regardless, it sounds like we might actually have some new Dunk and Egg in the future. I mean, George has to make some sort of move with Dunk and Egg. They're filming season 2 right now, which will be The Sworn Sword, and then I imagine they're immediately going to start working on the Mystery Knight before the actor for Egg gets too old. And we read a couple days ago that Ira Parker, the showrunner, said that Martin has told him a bunch of outlines for like 12 future novellas. So, I mean, if that's what he chooses to go with, just giving them outlines, that's fine. Or Martin could actually publish them himself and kind of try to keep pace with the show. Maybe releasing the 4th novella by the time the 4th season comes out. Either before or after, I'm not sure. And the same thing with the 5th novella, and on and on. Maybe I'm being a little bit too hopeful with that speculation, but I don't know, I can see that happening. Again, a lot of money on the table. If you can help market your premiere HBO series, A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, and even help promote House of the Dragon, by the way, by saying, hey, new work by George R.R. Martin, go buy it. Go buy it with this tie-in cover with the HBO logo on the front cover, something hideous like that. I could see that happening. Basically just merchandise to help boost Warner Brothers subscribers. Nice. Anything to help the shareholders. Anyways, that was a lot of rambling. Consider this a podcast episode, I guess. Episode 1 of the Crusader Chris podcast. Episode 2 coming TBD. Just give me something for the pain and let me whatever.